Flames crawled the hallway like a living thing, and she stood barefoot on the lawn, clutching a scorched key ring that no longer fit any lock. Sirens receded, neighbors whispered. A single object was carried out by a firefighter and set beside her. A century-old suitcase, its leather blistered but intact. This was the moment everything changed, long before she knew why. Weeks later, she was living in a borrowed room, grief stacked beside cardboard boxes, insurance investigation pending. The suitcase arrived by courier from probate, a family relic nobody had opened in decades. Why had her husband's grandmother guarded it? Inside was direction, not cash. To understand the map inside, we need to go back to what burned. The house had been ordinary, a patchwork of birthdays and grocery lists, until the night it turned to a silhouette of itself. She watched firefighters work a job that didn't have a hero ending. In the aftermath, she held a heat-warped wedding ring that no longer fit her finger and a list of losses her mind refused to finish. Stakes aren't abstract when your life is on paper. Birth certificates, the deed, photographs curling into ash. The investigator walked the rubble with a clipboard, marking rooms that no longer existed. Cause undetermined, he said at first. Then the insurer's letter arrived with a colder phrase, contesting cause. Payments paused, bills didn't. She slept on a friend's couch, careful not to take the good blanket, careful not to cry in the kitchen. Every day she avoided the mailbox like it might bite. Debt noticed her before anyone else did. Utilities, the credit card, the mortgage that didn't burn. Grief made her clumsy, bureaucracy made her small. Meanwhile, probate cracked open another door. An elderly aunt had passed months earlier, and with her estate came unlabeled boxes, a tin of buttons, and one heavy suitcase with 192's hardware that clicked like a typewriter key. The tag bore her husband's grandmother's initials, stitched with thread that had outlived its maker. People had joked for years about the old country title, a family story everyone treated like folklore told after dessert. Nobody had ever found proof. Nobody had ever asked the right box. She set the suitcase on the borrowed bed and just rested her palms on it. The leather felt like a tired animal. She didn't open it that night. Hope, after all, can be sharp. The next morning, she gathered courage the way you gather breath before a long dive and unlatched it. But before that hinge, there was a quieter loss that mattered. Identity had eroded with the house. Without a driver's license, the DMV turned her into an appointment number. Without the deed, the mortgage company called more often, less gently. She was named executor almost by default, the only one left willing to sign things. The title sounded like authority. It felt like a thin coat in a hard winter. At the fire site, investigators sifted for points of origin, measuring, photographing, speaking in careful tones. She tried to help by naming what used to be there. That corner was a desk, the drawers had passports, the file box had insurance. The list became a eulogy for paperwork. A neighbor found a single picture frame in the grass. The glass had melted into waves. Faces on the photograph blurred like they were underwater. She put it in a bag anyway. The suitcase entered this fragile ecosystem like an uninvited guest who somehow understood the rules. It was heavier than it looked. The buckles resisted, then relented. Inside, she expected mothballs and yellow lace. Instead, she found layers of paper that had learned patience, ship manifests, stamps from ports that no longer existed, ration coupons clipped with neat scissors, a photograph of a couple squinting into sun that wasn't American. Rumors had said title, but what does title mean if the chain is broken? Her husband's grandmother had carried silence better than most. Now silence had a form, brittle paper, precise handwriting, dates that marched across decades. Between two folded maps, a smaller envelope rode along the lining, brittle enough to crack. The initials matched the suitcase tag. Inside, a slip of ciphered text waited for someone who wouldn't give up when letters refused to behave. What nobody knew at the time lived between cracked leather and brittle paper. In that moment, the stakes shifted. This wasn't cash in a hidden pocket. It was something more complicated, a direction through a maze. If she could follow it, there might be a way out of debt, out of rooms that smelled like other people's soap, out of the slow humiliation of asking for extensions. Meanwhile, the insurer's investigator called again, tone neutral, questions pointed, appliances, wiring, last maintenance. Every answer felt like stepping across ice that remembered names. She wrote everything down now, every call, every file number, a new habit born from losing the old ones. The thing about human nature is we learn to document when we realize memory burns too. She returned to the suitcase and touched the topmost document like it might wake. The corner of a hand-drawn map peeked through. The edges smelled faintly of dust and sea. If this was folklore, it had receipts. She didn't know yet that the map would align with a parcel where concrete now lived. She didn't know yet that a century-old trust had left breadcrumbs no one had bothered to follow. She only knew this: the path forward would run on paper, and she would have to walk it. She cleared a space on the borrowed bed, set a legal pad beside her like a witness, and began to lift the layers. Paper slid over paper with the soft rasp of time, ship manifests listed names that had learned to travel, columns of ink where a single letter could change a life, dates stacked into a staircase, 1919, 1927, 1933, a ration book with neat stamps, a theater program in a language she didn't speak, a menu from a ship that promised coffee and oranges as if joy were a course, steaks sharpened in her hands. If this suitcase held nothing but souvenirs, then it was a shrine to absence. If it held proof, it might be a bridge. Hope pressed against fear, like two palms on a glass door. She kept going. A hand-drawn map surfaced, folded into itself so many times it felt like it had learned to be small. She eased it open. Lines sketched a rural valley, a river bending like an elbow, a road named for a tree that didn't survive. A rectangle was shaded in, marked with initials and a date. In the lower corner, coordinates written in a tidy, insistent hand. The paper smelled faintly of starch and attic air. Then a detail that caught breath, a note sewn into the lining. The fabric gave way with a seam ripper borrowed from her friend's mending kit. Inside, a slip of paper no larger than a receipt, crammed with letters that refused to form words. It looked like nonsense until she saw the marginalia, two initials that matched the tag on the handle. He told stories of his grandmother's stubbornness. Here it was, encoded. The micro-stories lived in the photographs. A couple at a dock, hat brims tilted toward a wind that had opinions, a small child holding a wooden horse, a street sign half visible behind them, a clue that would matter later. She arranged the photos in a line and felt a family walking forward. What nobody knew at the time was that the map didn't point to a farmhouse lost to weeds. When she overlaid the coordinates onto a present-day map on her phone, her stomach tightened. The parcel sat under an industrial spread, rectangles of roofs, a tangle of rail spurs, an address on a road renamed for efficiency. Concrete had grown where pasture once breathed. She flipped deeper, notarized receipts on onion skin paper, embossed seals that fought the years and won, tax stamps from the 133s, small proud squares adhered at perfect angles. A reference to a trust phrased the old way with heirs described as issue, natural, or adopted. There was a bank ledger number, handwritten and underlined twice. The ink bled slightly as if insistence could travel. Action took over. She copied every number, every date. She photographed pages with her phone, each click a small insurance policy against loss. A ledger sheet listed deposits of modest amounts and one line with a sum that didn't fit, the kind of figure that hinted at a sale or an advance. The note beside it read, "Hold pending papers," papers, plural. The suitcase suddenly felt less like an artifact and more like a filing cabinet abandoned mid-sentence. The ciphered note nagged, the letters arranged in patterns repeating like a melody played off key. Along the bottom edge of the suitcase under the lining, she found a thin booklet, a hymnal index brittle, its spine stiff. She hesitated, then aligned the index numbers to the jumbled letters, a substitution that clicked into sense. The decoded line named a bank branch that had since closed, and a box reference that felt like a dare. It also mentioned contracts, mine, and surface K, a pairing she didn't understand yet. Impact landed in the space between panic and resolve. This wasn't a myth, it was a claim buried under time and indifference. But claims have enemies, missing records, closed institutions, companies that rely on people giving up. If she could prove the chain from that shaded rectangle to her husband's line, it wouldn't just be land. It would be history that owed them interest. She laid the map flat and traced the boundary with her finger. The river's bend still existed on satellite images, a stubborn geography that refused to be paved out of memory. The road's new name still followed the old trail, a faint echo under asphalt. One detail would prove crucial later, a tiny X between two notations, oak stump and stone pile. Survey marks from a time when people measured land by what they could touch. The X sat beneath a corner of a present-day loading dock. She stacked the documents in a careful order. Photographs, receipts, tax slips, maps, cipher, ledger reference. The suitcase's purpose snapped into focus. It wasn't hiding wealth, it was scaffolding for truth. To follow paper, she'd have to walk where memory stopped. County records, dusty drawers, microfilm that hummed with the sound of patience. She closed the suitcase gently, palms lingering on the leather. The thing about human nature is we can carry two truths at once, heartbreak and a plan. She breathed, steadied herself, and wrote one sentence on the legal pad. Proved the chain, then asked the land to remember. County records don't welcome you, they tolerate you. She walked into the courthouse with the suitcase's copies in a manila folder, and the map folded small enough to feel like a secret. The records room smelled like toner and old glue. A clerk with kind eyes and careful boundaries pointed toward microfilm cabinets that hummed like old refrigerators. Start with grantor-grantee index, the clerk said. Start with ancestors who didn't know their names would become trails. Stakes were simple and brutal. Without proof, the map was a bedtime story. With proof, it was leverage. She threaded the microfilm, spun the crank, watched names swim past. The family surname changed spelling twice in a single decade. An ocean's accent fossilized in ink. Deeds flickered by like birds startled from a hedge. Warranty, quick claim, easement. One entry mattered. A 1931 purchase of a rural parcel bounded by a river and the lane to the oak. The seller's name matched a photo's scrawled caption. She printed it, the paper warm in her hands like a small victory, but the next page revealed a gap. A deed out recorded in the 195s didn't appear. The volume jumped. The clerk leaned over, voice soft. Flood took out that year's books back in the day. We've got partial backups. Missing volumes meant missing memory. She smiled thanks and kept going. People assume paper is passive. It isn't. It resists, hides, and sometimes points. She traced the parcel through plat maps, lines growing straighter as machines replaced stones and stumps. The map from the suitcase matched a pre-war plat with uncanny fidelity. The same bend of river, the same rectangle shaded for emphasis. A marginal note on the plat mattered. Mineral reservation upon conveyance. Sea trust. Trust. The word threaded everything she held. Across town, the story had modern edges. The parcel on her overlay sat under an industrial complex with spotless floors and a legal department that answered the phone like a metronome. She called anyway, breathing evenly. I'm researching historical title on your parcel. The receptionist transferred her to counsel. The lawyer's tone was polite, then firmer. We hold clean, marketable title, quieted decades ago. He didn't ask her name, he asked what she wanted. Records, she said. Chain of title abstracts. A pause. You're welcome to check county records, he replied. Translation. We're confident and we prefer you tired. What nobody knew at the time was the county held an overlooked story. A retired surveyor volunteered at the records room on Thursdays, the kind of man who measured time by property corners and coffee breaks. When she asked about old boundary disputes near the river bend, his eyebrows climbed. There was a handshake deal out there, he said. Lines got fuzzy. Folks settled it without paper. He pointed to a dusty drawer. If it's anywhere, it's there. In that drawer, she found an abandoned, quiet title petition from the 197s that fizzled. The file was thin and wrong. An affidavit, referenced but missing, should have tied heirs to the original trust. Without it, certainty dissolved. But the suitcase had a habit of finishing other people's sentences. Among the onion skin receipts was a trust transfer tax paid in 1937 and never properly recorded. Names on the receipt matched the petition's caption. She aligned them on the table, document against document, watching gaps close like a zipper. The clerk, now invested, walked her to the back counter. If you can prove the lineage in the reservation language, you've got a path. You'll need a lineage affidavit, a current survey tied to the original monuments, and a court to bless it. The list read like a climb. She wrote each item down, he added, and expect pushback, which sounded like weather, not doom. Action accelerated. She visited the assessor's office for historic parcel IDs, traced tax rolls through decades, noted a year when taxes were paid by trustee, a phrase that anchored the reservation's existence. She pulled a map from the 194 showing the oak stump and stone pile still references corners. Modern surveys reference iron pins. Old surveys reference things that breathe and erode. To reconcile them, she'd need a cadastral survey and someone willing to translate time. At lunch, she met the retired surveyor at a diner where the coffee understood patience. He sketched on a napkin, hands steady. If your grandma-in-law's map lines up with his pre-war plat, we can shoot bearings from the river's meander. If the industrial site's coordinates ignore the reservation, that's a crack. He paused. Courts like continuity, they hate surprises. Meanwhile, the corporation's lawyer sent a letter that read like a door. We assert fee simple absolute, no reservations encumbering title. She read it twice, then placed it beside the trust receipt stamped and dated before men in suits drafted that certainty. What nobody knew at the time was that ink and stamps can outstare confidence. She assembled a binder, certified copies of the 1931 deed, the trust receipt, the pre-war plat with marginalia, the abandoned petition, and a draft lineage chart drawn from ship manifests and baptism records she hadn't yet obtained but could chase. A pro bono clinic at the courthouse opened on Tuesdays. She went, binder hugged close like a life preserver. A volunteer attorney with tired eyes and a quick mind flipped pages, then looked up. You might have a reserved rights claim. Surface may have transferred, subsurface and royalties might not have. You'll need a court to confirm. Start with a petition for declaratory judgment and a quiet title as to the reservation. Impact arrived quietly. A legal pathway had appeared where, a week earlier, only ash and rumor lived. It would be slow, it would be hard, but it was real. She walked out into afternoon light that felt less indifferent. Proof of heirs across oceans and wars remained the problem that could collapse everything. She tightened her grip on the binder. Paper had brought her this far. People would have to carry it the rest of the way. Genealogy isn't romance, it's carpentry. You fit joints that don't want to meet. She started with the ship manifest from the suitcase and worked forward. A surname with one vowel on the dot gained another at the registry. Two brothers arrived months apart. One kept the old spelling, one didn't. In a church basement that smelled like bleach and candles, a volunteer slid baptism ledgers across the table. Ink bled through thin pages, names, dates, godparents who later reappeared as witnesses on deeds. The chain began to feel less theoretical. It had voices, stakes pressed hard. One missing signature from a descendant in a country she'd never visited could collapse the claim. Grief and bureaucracy built a strange duet. Every night she called overseas at odd hours, her voice bouncing through time zones, asking distant cousins to trust a stranger with a story about land under an American factory. Some hung up, one laughed and then apologized and then listened. Slowly, affidavits formed, sworn statements notarized in places where the notary asked, "Why does this matter?" To understand the cipher, she returned to the hymnal index hidden in the suitcase lining. The decoded line had named a bank branch, long closed, and a box reference that felt like a whisper meant for one person. She walked into the successor bank with a folder and a measured breath. Policies don't bend for grief, but they sometimes nod to lineage. She presented death certificates, marriage records, the chain of kin. "We no longer maintain access to historical safe deposit boxes," the manager said, then added, "Records were relocated to our archive facility." A pause long enough to be a test. "You can petition as next of kin." Petitioning meant paperwork dressed as ritual. She filed a request with the court, attached proof from the suitcase and the family tree she was building in pencil and prayer. Weeks passed. Meanwhile, she visited a genealogy society where retirees make miracles with microfilm. A volunteer traced the grandmother's birth village through a parish register that had survived war and water. The Ellis Island record showed a clerk's attempt to pronounce a name shaped like another alphabet. The woman in the photo from the suitcase gained coordinates. She had stood under a sign on a street whose name would later help prove identity in a notarized comparison. The court granted limited access. The bank's archive lived in a warehouse where time felt neatly boxed. A supervisor escorted her to a table and set down a ledger as thick as a family. The page for the branch matched the numbers from the cipher. Box assigned to an initial trust, dates lined up with the suitcase receipts. The box itself had been drilled decades ago and contents inventoried, then stored. She signed for a sealed envelope, her signature suddenly important to strangers. In that envelope, contracts breathed again. Purchase agreements typed on paper that held creases like scars, a mineral rights addendum built from language that lawyers still use because it's hard to improve on precision. Grantor conveys surface estate, reserves all oil, gas, and minerals, together with the right to receive royalties from production. The date predated any sale the corporation's lawyer bragged about. A bank officer hovered, curious but professional. "This is significant," he said carefully. She nodded, aware that significance doesn't pay a bill until a judge says so. The revelation rearranged the map in her head. The family hadn't lost everything. They'd kept what couldn't be seen. Rights flow underneath borders like groundwater, ignored until someone sinks a well. A ledger entry noted royalty payments suspended pending title confirmation. The confirmation never came because the affidavit went missing and the family scattered. The suitcase had come to finish the pause. Meanwhile, across town, the E.I. Corporation realized her paperwork might actually hold. The tone of their letters shifted from declarative to conditional. Without conceding any claim, they wrote, "We are reviewing historical reservations." Their lawyer requested copies. Her pro bono team advised caution. She provided certified excerpts, the kind that carry weight when someone tries to pretend paper is just paper. The retired surveyor returned with preliminary bearings. His field notes drew a neat line from oak stump to modern corner pins. The reservation clause didn't care about fences, it cared about intent. She filed a lineage affidavit, each name a rung, each sworn statement a fastener. Distant cousins signed in small town halls under clocks that ran a minute slow. She mailed notarized pages to the court with tracking numbers she checked like blood pressure. The judge set a hearing date. In the meantime, she read the grandmother's small note tucked behind the addendum. "We saved what we couldn't spend." The sentence landed like a benediction and a dare. Borders weren't just lines on plats, they were the edges of a life she was rebuilding. She learned how mineral royalties are calculated, not to get rich quick, but to not be fooled slow. She called the state's oil and gas commission, asked about production on the parcel, learned there had been extraction one county overtied through pooling agreements. Accounting might reach through those agreements like a hand through a doorway. At night, she taped the family tree to a wall and drew arrows. Ship to dock, dock to baptism, baptism to marriage, marriage to deed, deed to reservation, reservation to royalties. The analogy felt simple, a hidden path through dense woods. You don't bulldoze it, you trace it with care. When she slept, it was the sleep of someone carrying a fragile bowl across a crowded room. In the morning, she lifted it again. The bowl didn't spill, it gathered. The corporation's first real move wasn't a lawsuit, it was a smile shaped like a check. A goodwill settlement, the letter called it. A number that sounded generous if you didn't know what words like reservation and royalties could do over decades. She set the offer beside the mineral addendum and didn't reach for a pen. Stakes were plain, accept fast and small, or fight slow for what the paper actually promised. She found a legal aid clinic that smelled like stale coffee and effort. A coordinator listened, then scanned her binder page by page with the patience of someone who believes in receipts. You've got a case, he said. It won't be quick. A pro bono team formed around her, a property lawyer who'd memorized the state's quiet title statute, a young associate who loved footnotes, and a paralegal who could charm a clerk into finding a box nobody had seen in 20 years. They filed a petition to quiet title as to the reserved rights and for declaratory judgment on royalties and accounting. The suitcase documents became exhibits, each stamped, indexed, and sworn into relevance. Court felt like a foreign language spoken in slow motion. The corporation appeared with a row of suits and a tone that suggested patience had a budget. Their counsel moved to exclude the suitcase papers as hearsay, as family lore dressed as legal proof. Her attorney rose, voice calm. These are contemporaneous business records, notarized, with corroborating bank ledger entries and a recorded plat noting reservation. The family Bible does not make law, the documents do. The judge's eyebrows lifted just slightly. Then came the challenge she'd expected. Authenticity. Opposing counsel questioned ink, stamps, signatures. A forensic document examiner took the stand, a quiet expert who treated paper like a living witness. He'd analyzed the ink composition, the stamp impressions, the aging patterns. The inks correspond to known formulations from the 193s, he testified. Embossed seals match period devices used by the name notary, no indications of post hoc fabrication. The words landed without fanfare, which made them heavier. The corporation pivoted to boundary. If the reservation existed, they argued, it didn't touch the productive units. A retired surveyor, her diner ally, testified with a map rolled flat by habit. He traced bearings from river meanders to modern pins, tied the oak stump and stone pile to coordinates that still mean something to instruments, if not to trees. The pre-war plat aligns with intolerances, he said. Any modern deed that ignored the reservation did so by omission, not by law. He tapped a corner that overlapped with the industrial site's loading dock. This is the hinge. What nobody in the gallery knew was how much rode on a judge's patience. Days stretched. Her team built a timeline, the way you build scaffolding, piece by piece, until the shape could hold weight. They introduced the safe deposit inventory, the mineral addendum, the bank ledger note reading, payment suspended pending confirmation, the abandoned 197's petition, and the lineage affidavit stitched across oceans. Each exhibit answered a doubt someone hoped would stay hungry. The corporation's lawyer tried a different angle, laches, the argument that delay itself should defeat her. Her attorney met it with the facts. They couldn't act while records were misplaced, heirs unlocated, and access to the bank's inventory ungranted. You don't punish caution when the system itself misplaced the keys. He let the suitcase sit on counsel table like a quiet co-counsel. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday that smelled like rain. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. On the record before me, the reservation exists, was never released, and runs with the land. Surface conveyances did not extinguish it. He ordered royalties from the contested units placed into escrow, pending final accounting and apportionment, and granted preliminary recognition of the family trust's reserved rights. The room didn't gasp, it exhaled. Impact was immediate and strange. The corporation's next letter didn't posture, it proposed mediation. Her lawyers nodded. Recognition wasn't liquidity. Numbers lived on paper, not in her hands. But leverage had changed the weather. The insurer, suddenly more flexible, returned calls. A credit manager who'd spoken in scripts now used her name. Small mercies that meant heat and less fear of the mailbox. Mediation wasn't movie drama. It was incremental math in a windowless room. A neutral read the file like scripture. Her team presented a forensic accounting model, decades of suspended royalties, statutory interest, pooling adjustments, minus what time erases. The corporation countered with spreadsheets that treated history like a rounding error. Back and forth offers moved in inches, not leaps. The mediator pressed both sides toward a number that felt less like victory and more like justice late to its own hearing. She thought of the grandmother's line, "We saved what we couldn't spend," and understood it anew. Saving isn't just money, it's rights, language, the stubborn insistence that a promise made on paper still counts when the people who made it are gone. When the mediator finally wrote a number on a legal pad and slid it across, the room went quiet. A lump sum now, plus a defined percentage of future production, audited quarterly, with a reporting regime that could be enforced. Confidentiality mandatory, dignity implied. She signed with a hand that didn't shake. Then she went home and sat with the suitcase. The leather had dried into a map of its own. She ran her fingers along the cracks like tracing roads. Recognition had opened the door. Walking through it would be another kind of work. Leverage changed the air, but air doesn't pay bills. She sat at the kitchen table in the borrowed room and began the slow arithmetic of restitution. Forensic accounting looks like patience wearing glasses. She and the pro bono team built a timeline, first production dates, suspensions noted in ledgers, pooling agreements that braided parcels together, interest under statute ticked forward like a second hand that refused to stop for grief. Stakes pressed in again. Could she translate recognition into heat, medicine, rent before the tide of debt took her feet out from under her? The mediator's framework promised a number, but numbers hide behind evidentiary doors. She gathered pay stubs from a decade ago, tax filings, correspondence that confirmed she hadn't been sleeping while history tried to skip her. The corporation's accountant sent spreadsheets with 6 decimals. Her team countered with a ledger of missed payments that read like a diary. Meanwhile, she called the insurer with a new tone, steady, documented. The court's escrow order became leverage. "Circumstances have changed," she said, and attached the judge's ruling. The claims manager, who once sounded like a recorded message, shifted. "We can authorize a partial payout while cause remains under review." It wasn't everything, but it was heat turned on, a deposit on a rental, a pause in the relentless countdown of dues. Small mercies accumulated. A creditor waived late fees in light of pending resolution. A neighbor retrieved a box of Smoke Street keepsakes from a storage unit and offered to hold them as long as needed. A friend forwarded a grant listing for emergency housing. It wasn't charity, it was a scaffold. The thing about human nature is we survive by stacking small kindness until they look like a staircase. Back in mediation, they argued about time. The corporation wanted a shorter look back, a window that ignored the early years when records went missing. Her attorneys pointed to the bank inventory, the ledger line, payments suspended pending confirmation, the abandoned petition that stopped everything without ending anything. The mediator underlined words, circled dates, and kept returning to one phrase: equitable accounting. Parallel to the legal grind, she returned to the parcel on a cold morning and stood by the fence line where trucks came and went. The river still bent its old way. She watched the loading dock that covered the survey's stone pile and understood that the ground can hold 2 stories at once, one visible, one owed. She whispered the grandmother's line, "We saved what we couldn't spend," then went back to the table where receipts make their arguments. The insurer released a partial check. She moved into a small rental with doors that locked and a window that faced a tree spared by the fire. She paid down the worst of the balances, bought a second-hand desk, and laid the binder on it like a promise to finish what began before she was born. Nights were quieter, not because fear left, but because hope started paying rent. When the settlement landed, it didn't arrive like a drum roll. It slid across the mediator's table as a typed term sheet. Lump sum within 30 days, audited royalty percentage on future production, quarterly statements, audit rights, confidentiality. The lawyers nodded. She read every line twice. It wasn't a windfall, it was a reckoning paid late, with interest that knew the value of years gone missing. She signed again, this time with a pen that felt heavier. Wire confirmations followed, numbers appearing in an account that had almost forgotten how to hold abundance. Her first purchase wasn't a car or a dress, it was a consultation with a fiduciary to build a trust that could carry what the suitcase had carried: clarity, continuity, intent. She set aside funds to rebuild a home, to retire debt without fanfare, to breathe without counting. Impact radiated quietly. The present value letter when her attorney ran the discounted sums approximated $10 million when lump and royalty projections met on the same page. The figure didn't feel like luck, it felt like paper keeping its word. She called the retired surveyor and paid his invoice with a tip, large enough to make him laugh and then go silent. She mailed a thank you to the clerk who had opened the dusty drawer. She delivered pastries to the legal aid office and wrote a check that would underwrite someone else's Tuesday. Before she touched any of it for herself, she went back to the ashes. The lot was a rectangle of memory and weeds. She knelt, pressed a palm into cold soil, and said the names of the people whose handwriting had pulled her through. Then she folded a copy of the map, wrapped it in waxed paper, and buried it beside a sapling that would one day throw shade on a rebuilt porch. On the way home, she stopped at the courthouse and filed the final stipulations the settlement required, deed corrections that threaded the reservation through time with the clarity it had earned, the chain at last unbroken. Before she could claim any of it as a future, she had to face where the past had ended. The lot was smaller without walls, a rectangle of packed earth and stubborn weeds. Wind moved through the empty, the way it moves through a mouth missing teeth. She parked across the street and sat for a minute, hands on the steering wheel, feeling her pulse catch up. Stakes weren't financial here. They were names, vows, the promise she'd made to be the last link that didn't break. She carried a young tree from the trunk, a shovel, and a small tin that held a folded copy of the map. A neighbor stepped onto the sidewalk, the same one who'd once handed her a smoke-streaked picture frame. He didn't speak, just nodded, then fell in beside her. Polite in his silence, she chose a spot where the kitchen used to be, not by measurement but by memory, 3 steps from where the stove had stood. A half turn to where he'd kept the coffee. The shovel bit through soil that had swallowed nails and glass and a year of her life. She dug until the hole felt like a cradle. Then she set the sapling in, teased the roots, and filled the gap, pressing earth with her palms like a benediction. In that moment, grief asked for a different shape. She opened the tin, took out the copy of the map wrapped in waxed paper, and read the grandmother's line aloud, voice steady even as it scraped. "We saved what we couldn't spend." The neighbor folded his hands. No sermon, no applause, just 2 people standing with a sentence that had crossed a century to be heard. She lowered the map into a second smaller hole beside the tree, a private archive under future shade, not to hide it but to honor it. Paper had carried her here. Now earth would carry the paper. She placed the tin, covered it, and smoothed the soil. The wind shifted and brought the faint smell of the river from 6 blocks away, proof that some bearings don't move. Speaking of bearings, there was a parallel ritual awaiting its witness. She drove to the courthouse, climbed the stairs that had become familiar, and filed the final deed corrections. Clean, precise pages that threaded the reservation through the index with the clarity the court had ordered. The clerk stamped them, the thud of the seal sounding like a door closing softly where a draft had lived too long. Meanwhile, she met with the community foundation in a room with a whiteboard that still held last week's goals. She signed papers establishing a small fire relief grant under the grandmother's name, not a monument but a mechanism. Grocery cards after a blaze, hotel vouchers, deposit help for rentals, a list of practical mercies that feel like daylight. She funded it quietly. The director shook her hand and said, "People will breathe easier because of this." She answered, "So will I." Back at the lot, she returned with a simple marker. No dates, just a line. We remembered. She didn't want to claim the land with past tense. She wanted to seed it with continuity. She touched the tree's thin trunk, felt the logic of things that grow, slow, upright, toward light. The house would be rebuilt modestly, differently. She didn't draw it yet. She let the idea sit, like a sketch waiting for the next line. A neighbor brought a thermos and 2 paper cups. They stood at the curb and sipped by the quiet. He said, "You did it." She shook her head. "We finished what they started." He nodded, satisfied. Micro-truths like that settled deeper than praise. In the weeks that followed, she visited both places, the lot and the records room, like tending 2 altars. Each time she watered the sapling, she felt the suitcase in her hands again, the crackle of brittle paper, the insistence of ink. Each time a clerk slid a stamped page across the counter, she heard the grandmother's stubbornness as if it were a metronome for living. Grief didn't vanish, it learned new steps. On mornings when the mailbox didn't scare her anymore, she still reached for the habit and then smiled at the ghost of it. At night, she placed the suitcase on a shelf, not as a trophy, but as an assignment she'd completed and now had to teach. Responsibility has its own weight. She found she could carry it without folding. The suitcase stopped being a container and became a compass. The map wasn't just lines and coordinates, it was a way of seeing value where others see waste, of trusting quiet records over loud certainty, of choosing to bring the past into a courtroom and a garden at the same time. The thing about human nature is we heal by giving meaning a job. In the aftermath, choices simplified. Money would fix what money can. The rest would be work, presence, and the courage to stay. She locked her car, looked once more at the sapling, and walked away without checking the rear view. The wind moved through the empty, softer now. The map underground kept its secrets. The tree above learned. The neighborhood's light and she at last found her way home. She didn't buy silence, she bought room to breathe, a modest rebuild, safe wiring, a mortgage retired without ceremony. She funded scholarships for surveyors, archivists, and firefighters, the people who keep boundaries true and people alive. She paid the retired surveyor's clinic bill quietly. She created a public digital archive of the suitcase, every page scanned, indexed, free. Secrets stop hoarding value when light finds them. The fortune became infrastructure, a trust with rules, a grant that moves when sirens fade, a habit of answering letters from strangers trying to follow their own paper. Guarded secrets outlast love, but only become wealth when someone risks daylight. If this story resonated with you, share how your family preserves its history in the comments below. Subscribe for more true stories of resilience and discovery, and watch the next episode to see how another hidden inheritance reshaped a town.